Have you ever felt like you can't find that one perfect main to play? Or maybe even worse, you're playing the wrong main? Finding the perfect main for you can skyrocket your progress and help you to dramatically improve. But in this video, you're going to have everything you need to find that right main and maybe even swap the main you're playing right now because it's not a right fit for you. But the holidays are finally here, so I'm offering a 20% off coaching special, only 10 slots available. So if you want a chance to get coaching at a discounted rate, so you can check it out down below and join the many others that have skyrocketed rank after joining. Don't miss out, and I'll see you there. Now, first off, we do got to talk about the tanking role, and within the tanking role, there's a lot of differing playstyles, and it's pretty hard to know what kind of character you should main or what kind of playstyle you like to play. But the easiest way to divide the tanks is by their effective range and their mobility. If a character is close range in their effective range and has no vertical mobility, they're almost always going to be a Brawl tank. Examples of this are Queen, Zarya, Reinhardt. These characters don't have any way to take a high ground out of nowhere, so they're not going to be diving in. They have a close effective range, so they want to get up close and personal. This makes them Brawl tanks. And this is the sub role that really likes to find that optimal engagement and just kind of go ham. You really want to get close, personal, beat down, and have a straight up slugfest with the enemy. Now, you're not always going to just be running it down, but that is when you're most effective, is when you're able to get in close, do everything you want to do without being stopped, and you're kind of picking and choosing that moment to go. But once you find that opportunity, you're going all in and you're brawling it out. But the next category of tank is a far ranging tank that is effective from a further range and has no vertical mobility as well. So characters in this category would be like Sigma, Malga, and kind of Orisa, where Orisa overlaps a little bit with Brawl, but we'll get to that a little bit later. Now, this sub role is a lot more about control. You're poking from a distance. You're poking from range. You are not going in and trying to close in the gap and really trade blows from close range. You're trying to whittle down the opposition. You're trying to deny what they're doing, slowly accumulate resources, and slowly you're whittling down the enemy team. You're forcing them into really uncomfortable areas, and you're building up your really precious and powerful ultimates. This is not a sub role that is going to finish fights quickly. You're not finding that perfect opportunity to go in and make a ton of things happen. You are attritioning out your opponent, slowly whittling them down, grinding them to a halt. And your primary goal in the sub role is grinding down your opponent's resources while simultaneously making them not that effective. So, for instance, if the Brawl character is trying to find an opportunity to go in and get into their close effective range, you are trying to constantly keep your distance and whittle down their resources to the point where they never get to have that fight on their terms. So, two different styles of play, and regardless of the meta, you can force your style. If you like Brawl, you can force Brawl. If you like Poke, you can force Poke. It is very possible for you to decide the type of Overwatch you want to play, especially as the tank player. You get to kind of dictate most of these things. But that's not all of the tanks. There is one more category, close range, but with vertical mobility. And this would be dive tanks. And these are characters that could easily get to a high ground position on a dime, and they are still going to be effective primarily from close range. So they have to use that mobility to close in the gap, but they can do it in a much more dynamic way than a Brawl tank can. Examples of this would be Doomfist, Winston, and D.Va, all characters that can take the high ground on a dime and really close in that gap very, very quickly. Now, similar to the Brawl scenario, you are trying to find the optimal moments to really close in that gap, but unlike Brawl, instead of trying to just find ways to get into your effective range up against characters that are often trying to keep their distance from you, Dive is more like a surgeon, where you're really trying to find the optimal weakness in the enemy team while you don't have as much survivability and raw strength as a Brawl tank, so you're not able to just beat on the front line or whatever the case may be. You can surgically target key weaknesses, so while a Brawl tank might just get in close to a Sigma and start beating them down, a Dive tank would pass the Sigma, get to the Ana, and specifically target her instead. Now, while these are the key roles defined, it's important to understand that heroes are much more flexible than one style or composition. As an example, on a map that is very flat, not very much high ground, you don't necessarily need vertical mobility to have a dive. This is a really weird concept for some people, but think about it this way. You can play a Junker Queen in a dive composition, and that seems very odd to people, but if you think about it this way, a Junker Queen has a way to close in the gap. She has some mobility to get in close, right? It's not the best mobility in the world, but she can do it. She can shout and get in. If you don't need to go anywhere vertically, if you don't need to challenge anywhere vertically, you could 100% run a Junker Queen in a dive composition where you're shouting in, going in with Tracers and Genjis. It can 100% work, and it's more important about what your goal is rather than what is used to fulfill that goal, right? Every single character is just a tool to do a playstyle, and if you don't need high ground, if you don't need to jump the Ana at the top of Nubani, then who cares if your tank doesn't have the verticality to dive up there? If all you have to do is just play your little corner, find an opportunity, shout in, and go push to their backline. It's very, very similar in execution. In addition to all these things, consider that some heroes are a bit harder to counter than other heroes. So some heroes are going to have an easier time against counters because they play in a flexible way, or they can incorporate different styles of play. For example, a character like D.Va can play her distance, could play a very peel or denial style, but also a dive style, and depending on the way that she wants to get value, she can shift up her play. So she's a lot harder to counter than a character that has to fight in a very linear way. Think a character like Wrecking Ball, for instance, that really only has one way he can play, and if you manage to deny Wrecking Ball that one style of play, he is basically ineffective. Now, I'm not saying that you can't play characters that are easy to counter, but you need to recognize that your main is susceptible to certain characters, and you need to make it your job to understand counters inside and out and what you specifically can do to make it so you're still effective against them, because as you start to climb more, you're going to run into them more and more. The last thing that you need to consider is what way mechanically do you want to be challenged? Do you want to still be required to aim? Do you want to have really, really great aim, really great tracking? Certain characters require that, like Zarya and D.Va, but other characters not so much. Characters like Rein don't challenge you in the same way mechanically. Some characters are very unique and very Overwatch-centric, while some characters share overlap with other shooter games, and you could apply some of those mechanical things straight into Overwatch. Also, some characters require you to do more thinking, and some characters require you to be very quick in your reaction, and some characters require both. So a character like Sigma, nothing crazy is going to happen. You're not going to have to think like 100 miles per minute. You're basically allowed to think at your pace. Yes, you got to plan things out, and yes, you do require a lot of min-maxing, but you're not going to have to respond to things or rapidly input things in the same way that you would with a character like Doomfist that challenges you on a completely different axis reaction-wise. So now that you know the roles, you know what's expected of them, you know the different styles of play, how you can play, and the mechanical requirements, you have every tool you need to decide what hero or heroes you want to main within the tanking category. Moving on to the DPS, unfortunately, things are not as clear-cut, especially when we're trying to divide the roles, because there's all these terms being thrown out, like Hitscan and Projectile and Flex. What does these all mean, and what do they have to do with picking your main? Well, oftentimes, when we're talking about a scrim setting, DPS players were split based on mechanical requirements, mainly because you wanted people that are very good at a certain type of mechanics on certain heroes, because they're going to be the best at those roles, right? So oftentimes there was the hit scan role, and the hit scan role primarily consisted of people that had really good raw aim with hit scans, point and click. Basically, the idea behind most hit scans is that you have your cursor over a target, you press your trigger or you press your mouse, and it instantly registers a hit or a miss. So this would be characters like Widowmaker, Ashe, and Cassidy, and this was a very important role for a lot of different metas, and because the mechanical requirements were so stringent, right, there's always further you could advance your aim, you could always hit more shots, get better mechanically with Hitscan. It was a role that was kind of all by itself on an island, and then Projectile or Flex was basically everything else. If you played Pharah, Genji, Junkrat, or anything in between, you were put on Projectile or Flex. Just someone that was required to be flexible and play all these different characters. And mainly it came down to the fact that a lot of these characters weren't consistently meta enough for a justification to have people that only specialized in certain specific subcategories within these roles. Like, it doesn't make sense to have a Junkrat specialist, even if he plays way different than other projectiles, because he just never was meta. But it doesn't mean that Junkrat's play is very similar to these other characters. In fact, to group Junkrat with a character like Echo just kind of seems very odd, because their play patterns are not at all similar, nor are their mechanical requirements. On top of that, because the meta started changing and opening up, the Hitscan role started to include things that were not technically Hitscan, which is also very confusing, I understand, but let me try to make it as simple as possible. For the Hitscan role, characters like Hanzo and Sojourn technically are grouped in the Hitscan role. Not because they are actually Hitscan, but because the mechanical requirements are similar. If you're good at Ashe, if you're good at Widow, if you're good at Cassidy, you're probably going to be good at Sojourn. You're probably going to be good at Hanzo. So as you see, a lot of the grouping that exists has less to do with the actual qualifications of Hitscan, Projectile, or anything in between, but more so the mechanical similarities within the role and how you could easily learn or play other characters that share mechanical requirements. So to further that, the best way to find your perfect DPS is to find the type of play you want to play and the type of mechanical skill you want to enforce or be challenged upon. These are the most important things. And let's talk about how you want to play. There's high mobility characters. Characters that move around fast, have to have quick reaction, and oftentimes get to pick and choose when they engage the enemy. Characters like Tracer, Sombra, Genji. These characters have very high mobility, and this is a play style that people really like and some people really gravitate towards, and that's why you have often seen Tracer and Genji players being one and the same. Like, you would see that a lot on ladder, where a top Tracer player could also play a top Genji, and this seems very strange because Tracer's technically Hitscan, Genji is like a weird melee projectile. They don't share mechanically in other ways, but their playstyle is very similar. So if that's a playstyle you flock to, then you're very likely to have huge amounts of overlap in these characters regardless of the mechanical requirements. Maybe you want to play characters that are more about pick-oriented fights. You're trying to find an angle, you're trying to get picks, you're trying to do it from range. Characters like Widowmaker, Sojourn, and Hanzo, these all apply into that category. Or maybe you want to play a character that is very different from everything else, plays on a completely different axis. These are more specialty characters. Characters like Mei, characters like Junkrat, characters that operate or play in a very different way than many of the other common DPS. And these are going to be ones that you're going to have to try and find whether or not they fit your playstyle by themselves, because they don't really overlap with a lot of things. So you're not going to get any inkling of, I like this type of play. It's either you like that character or you don't. So what does this mean for picking your DPS? Well, it really comes down to how you want to play and how you mechanically want to be challenged. And I would say, especially as you start to expand your DPS pool to any other characters, you want them to share at least one of these two vectors. Like, when you branch off from one character, you don't want to be simultaneously changing how you play and how you're mechanically challenged. If you do it this way, you're going to severely stunt your development. So let me give you an example. Let's say you're playing a character like Tracer, who's mobility and tracking based hit scan, right? And you wanted to branch off to a different character to learn another main to add to your whole pool. You would want to find a character that either shares mobility, right? Very similar mobility based playstyle, character like Sombra or Genji or something along those lines. Or you would want to find a character that shares the mechanical side of things, the tracking, right? Technically Sombra is both, so that would be a really natural fit and you would be able to fit her very well into learning her. But if you just randomly moved to Torb as your secondary pick, he doesn't play a mobility based playstyle, nor does he require tracking in any meaningful way. So you're using none of the mechanical skills you've gained and none of the play instincts you've learned towards your Tor play, and you're wasting all that development trying to bring in a character that doesn't really share any similarities with what you already have. But maybe instead you would play a character like Soldier, where maybe he doesn't share the mobility aspect similar to Tracer, right? You're not going around and blinking around a target or kind of honing in on certain people, but he does do tracking in a very similar way, even if it's long range tracking, so there is a bit of adjustment, but it's going to be really easy for you to learn him and utilize a lot of the things you already learned on Tracer mechanically in his play. And that's another reason why you can see Tracer players and Soldier players also be really good mechanically on Zarya, because there's a lot of overlap, and you need to start seeing these overlaps because it's going to allow you to not only decide what characters and playstyles you like to play, but also what other characters you could expand to very easily because of the skills and instincts that you've already gained while grinding other characters that share similarities. Now, last but certainly not least, we do got to talk about the support role. And oftentimes you hear main support, off support, and people don't really understand what is even being meant. Like, what is a main support? Is it someone that can kind of be the predominant healer, or is that a main healer? What's an off support? What does that even mean? Well, the thing that is confusing about all of it is that main support and off support were purely scrim terms when they were created. Has nothing to do with ranked play, and the way that a scrim operates is different, and it's very similar to what I was explaining in the DPS category. Not sorted together by heals or your overall heals or anything like that. It's sorted together by mechanical skill or raw mechanical skill. And what I'm mainly talking about here is your aim, or your ability to hit difficult or hard to hit abilities. And this is why when we think about a main support in the scrim sense, it's all the characters that don't require very complex or difficult aim in a traditional FPS sense. So characters like Brig, Mercy, Lucio, Moira, Lifeweaver. None of these characters require you to be able to hit like a 360 no scope, right? So someone that has been grinding all these other shooters, they don't get that benefit on these characters. And if you don't have extensive aim skill, it doesn't really matter for these characters. You can still play these characters at a very high level without great aim at all. But the same things are not true for what the scrim players would call off supports. These are characters that do require traditional FPS mechanical skill, that do require you to hit difficult to hit abilities and hit freaking shots. Characters like Ana, Zen, Baptiste, and Alari. These are characters that require you to be very mechanically competent in a very similar way when we talked about a lot of DPS characters. These characters are going to have really strict mechanical requirements. And that's why when you come over to support, or you decide whether or not you want to play support, just because you want to shoot things and hit abilities doesn't mean you shouldn't not play support. There are characters for you within this role. In fact, it's a role that demands it. If you are playing characters like Ana, Zen, Bap, and Alari, and you can't aim mechanically well, if you don't have good mechanics, you need to figure that out as fast as possible, because you're going to be capped on your value, because your mechanical skill is tied in so directly to your value on those four characters. But if you want to still engage in the support role and climb and be one of the best support players without those really hard or difficult raw mechanical skill requirements, you can play main support, and that could be the perfect role for you. Now, granted, just because they're categorized by main and off support does not mean that these heroes within these roles or sub-roles share playstyles, because they 100% do not. If we think about a character like Brig, she's a denial character. She's more about being a bodyguard, denying enemy play, denying enemy aggression. Very different from almost all of the other supports, maybe with the exception of Lifeweaver, which does something similar, but more like a overlooking character that tries to find a way to deny and intervene from above and behind, and is really like a watchful eye. Characters like Mercy are primarily going to be enabling style characters that find themselves attached to a character that they want to amplify their value. Lucio is going to be someone that also can enable or peel / help their team, but a lot of Lucios will simply Reddit, which is kind of a much more off support oriented playstyle where you're relying more on raw mechanics and your ability to take duels. It feels very DPS-esque. I'm not saying it's the appropriate playstyle, but you can play Lucio in a way that almost makes him play like an off support and not a main one. And then characters like Zen and Alari or Iari are just like purely damage focused, where they're mainly just trying to get picks and deal damage over pretty much any of their other objectives. And that is like the thing that you need to be able to do reliably. And it's also why these characters' value are so tied into your raw mechanical skill, because if you can't hit shots, deal damage, be aggressive, then you're not getting value on these characters. Now, a lot of people ask me, what is the playstyle of Bap and Ana? And I would say that these are probably the two most flexible supports out of all the supports in the roster, primarily due to the fact that they can play in a lot of different ways. Like if we go back to Mercy, she pretty much has one playstyle, one way to get value with her, and you can get really good at that playstyle. You can find ways to amplify your movement, be very survivable, and get better at staying alive while utilizing that playstyle and find value in that way and differentiate yourself from other Mercies. But still, at the end of the day, there's just one playstyle, just one way to play the character correctly. But for Ana and Bap, there's a lot of ways. You could be more aggressive. You could be more damage oriented. You could be someone that heals a bit more but still finds aggressive value here and there based off your cooldown cycles. And sometimes, while it seems cool to have a character that could be very flexible, it can become really hard on you and your development when you don't know how you should be playing in any given situation. Like, there's a lot of different ways to play it, and you don't know if you're doing the right thing at all times, versus another character where you know the actions you're supposed to perform, you are just primarily working on doing them better and more optimized. That is the difference. Instead of trying to decide to do a whole bunch of different things and find the perfect solution to your problem, you know exactly what the solution is. You know exactly what you're supposed to do. You're just trying to optimize it. And it really is going to come down to you, what type of playstyle you prefer. What type of person are you? What kind of grind do you want to be on? Are you in the pursuit of doing that one thing perfectly? Are you in the pursuit of perfection of one thing? Are you the one that wants to practice the same kick 1,000 times, but be the best motherfucker at that one move? Or do you want to be someone that is capable of doing a lot of different things and being fluid? And I'm not saying there's one right or wrong answer here, because oftentimes what is good or bad in a meta or a situation is just varied. Like, it could be either of these playstyles and everything in between. So don't feel like you need to do it based on your win or loss. Find out the type of person that you are, the type of gameplay you want to play, and then this will better help you choose your support, your DPS, or your tank. But anyways, this is a full breakdown of all the roles, breaking down of the playstyles and the different mechanical requirements of every single character, so you know exactly what type of heroes you want to play, what characters you could add to your hero pool, or maybe if you should swap roles or heroes entirely. But definitely let me know if you have any questions down below. And don't forget our special Thanksgiving coaching special, 20% off and 10 spots only. So if you want to get coaching and quickly climb the ranks, check it out right now down below. Thank you, and we'll see you next time.